Hey guys, hope you're doing well. I just want to take a few minutes and touch on the common question of why is it often a dilemma or so difficult to come up with a universally accepted definition of mental disorder? So let me just pull up my notes here and we'll take a look. So the general agreement or the general definition of what a mental disorder is, and again, this can change depending upon the person you talk to in the book that you may read. But really, what we're looking at is a disturbance, okay, in thinking, emotion, and/or behavior. All right, and the key things are is that it causes a person to suffer, is self-destructive, and seriously or significantly impairs a person's ability to work, get along with others, and so forth. So those are really the key things when we talk about a mental health disorder or a mental disorder. And again, I really stress significant, okay, in terms of not just the impact that it has on that particular person, but also when we look at time. All right. So, how long did that particular behavior or disturbance in terms of their thinking, emotion, and so forth continue? How long was it there? All right. In terms of that. So when we think of mental disorders, again, we're thinking about some sort of abnormal behavior. Okay. And the difficulty really comes into, well, what do you mean by normal and abnormal behavior? Well, one way to really think about it is really to break it down into, well, does this particular behavior not only significantly impact the particular person's life, does it last over a long particular period of time? But we could really simplify it into really one of four different ways. All right. So let's take anxiety, for example. Anxiety is normal. You're supposed to have anxiety. Okay. However, when anxiety becomes so, and this is the first one, distressful. Okay. So what I mean by that is that anxiety becomes so extreme, so prolonged, okay, that it interferes with your basic capacity to really function at a baseline. All right. So it really impacts your basic coping skills. So I often give the example in my classes. I say, all right, so you've got a presentation. You have to give a class presentation in class. And you are anxious for whatever reason. You think you're going to make a fool of yourself, forget what you're going to say, whatever. So right before the presentation, you get up and run out of the room and you hide in the bathroom. Is that abnormal behavior? Does that mean you have a mental health disorder? Well, no. That just means you're anxious. That's kind of a common thing in terms of a presentation. Now, where it becomes abnormal behavior and where it starts to fall into this idea of being distressful, again, is it is manifested over a long period of time. So this particular behavior continues, not just only in your class, but we also start to see it popping up in other areas of your life. So maybe you start to isolate from hanging out with friends. Your anxiety becomes so extreme that you stop going to work. And again, one of the key things to this is that we start to see physical symptoms, sweating, shortness of breath, and so forth. So again, distress, extreme, prolonged emotional reactions. Okay. The second thing, and a lot of students get this confused, is that particular behavior demonstrating some sort of deviance? Now, when I say deviance, I don't mean bad. All right. What I mean by deviance is that particular behavior occurring less frequently than in the general population? So, is that particular behavior statistically, all right, smaller than what a lot of other people are doing in that particular population? So, for example, cutting. Okay, so cutting is considered an abnormal or a symptom of many mental health disorders. Why? Because when we look at statistically across our population, there's a minimal amount of people that are doing that particular thing. Okay. Now, where these types of things get really, really tricky is when we start looking at social norms, culture. So it's not always an absolute, so to speak. So there is some gray area in there that we have to be aware of. Dysfunction goes right along very nicely in terms of distress. So, is your anxiety, all right, for an example, not only interfering with your ability to go to school, but is it causing you dysfunction in other areas of your life, your social, your living, your work, things along those lines? And last but not least, the idea of dangerousness. So, is your particular behavior causing you to want to do harm to yourself? Is it causing you to want to do harm to others? And that's really the cornerstone to really any assessment. So, again, mental health disorder, we're looking at some kind of disturbance, thinking, emotion, behavior, and again, it really needs to fit into one of these particular categories in which I was talking about. So, is that particular disturbance causing you distress? Is it causing you deviance? Is it causing you dysfunction? And is it causing you some form of dangerousness? And again, you're supposed to feel sadness. You're supposed to feel anger. You're supposed to feel anxiety. You're supposed to feel stress. Those are not some form of abnormality. Those are not mental health disorders. Where they do start to fall into those particular categories, again, is when things are looked at as having a significant impact on that particular person's life, and they are happening over an extended period of time. All right, so why, again, do we keep coming back to this dilemma in terms of appropriately saying this is a mental health disorder and this is not? Well, one of the things I'll kind of start right off with is the way in which we categorize or diagnostically look at mental health disorders. So, what we may look at as abnormal here in the States, in other parts of the world, they're considered completely normal. So, we have to take into consideration cultural values. We have to take into consideration religious values. We have to take into consideration morals. We have to take into consideration the social norms, so to speak, of that particular population. So those really make it difficult sometimes to make these things very black or white. Here in the United States, we have what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's basically my reference guide in terms of diagnosing, in terms of identifying symptoms and other types of criteria. Again, in other parts of the world, they don't use that. They look at or use other references in terms of it. So the dilemmas of the definition, again, can be a problem. Some other things that tend to kind of come up in terms of the dilemmas of definition, limitations, things such as danger of overdiagnosis, power of diagnostic labels, inaccurate diagnoses. And again, one of the things that really pops up for me is this illusion that we are objectively identifying particular types of mental health disorders. That's not always the reality. It can be a little bit more subjective than what we really want to admit. So I'll give you a great example of that. Currently, here in the States, again, we use what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're in our fifth edition. So previous editions, and I'm really generalizing this, it's a little bit more complicated than what I'm making it appear. But our current edition in the DSM versus previous editions is very different in the way in which we look at mental health disorders and the way in which we diagnose. And again, I'm really simplifying this and I'm really generalizing it. In the past, we tended to look at mental health disorders very black or white. Either you had it or you didn't, right? In terms of how we diagnose, the criteria, and so forth. There's pros and cons to that. Our current way we look at mental health disorders and our current DSM couldn't be any different. We tend to now look at mental health disorders more on a spectrum, okay? Again, pros and cons to both sides. When we looked at the old way of doing things, very black and white, some of the pros of that were, well, it was very structured. Again, you either had it or you didn't. And based upon that, you would then kind of be filtered, for lack of a better word, in terms of particular treatment programs and so forth. Some of the cons to that was we were really not addressing or being very proactive in terms of addressing mental health concerns. So I'll give you a really bad example of that. Let's say someone comes in And again, I'm really generalizing this and simplifying it, but they come in and they've got complaints of being depressed. So there's 10 criteria, and you have to meet maybe 8 to be considered, major depressive disorder. Well, if they only had 4 or 5, they didn't meet criteria in terms of being majorly depressed in terms of that particular disorder. So we wouldn't really, ship them on their way, but the services and treatments and things like that, they just didn't get access to those particular things. The problem was, and we found this through research, and it seems like common sense now, someone who may be a 4 or 5 was turning into a 7, an 8, and a 9. So we weren't again being proactive. Now we look at things as a spectrum. So those people that weren't necessarily meeting the criteria in terms of major depressive disorder, we're now getting them services. We're now getting them involved in terms of treatment plans and so forth. Some of the cons to that is we may be overdiagnosing people. And as we know, labels can be very, very powerful in terms of whatever, physical, mental health, and so forth. So again, which one is better in terms of that? And you can see how a lot of that really contributes in terms of dilemmas of definition. So we talked about, moral issues, cultural issues, religious issues, the way in which we go about looking at diagnostic criteria in terms of objectivity, subjectivity, and so forth. And again, I'll just be very frank, times are changing. Being able to stay on top of what is accepted in terms of social norms, what is not accepted, those types of things are constantly changing in terms of what we think and what we feel is a mental health disorder or not. All right. A great example of that, and I'll kind of end on that note, is things like, for example, behavioral addictions. So, sex addictions, internet addictions, some food addictions, to an extent, shopping addictions, things like that. Believe it or not, we don't here in the States officially recognize those as a mental health disorder. Why? Again, we simply just don't have the research to support it. In many other countries in the world, they are recognized as official mental health disorders or addictions. Now, does that mean we don't address those when they come up in treatment? No, of course we do. We definitely address those particular things. And again, why? One of the big reasons is because now we tend to look at things at more of a spectrum. So we want to have this proactive, treatment approach in terms of demonstrating best practice and so forth. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better idea on how to tackle this particular question and why it's become so difficult to really come about and identify, this universally accepted mental health disorder. There's just so many variables and so many factors that we have to contribute for. All right, thank you very much. And again, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. All right, thanks, guys.